You know, there's a specific kind of silence that sits over Silver Creek Valley right before a storm rolls in, heavy, electric, the kind that makes the hair on your arms stand up and tells you something big is coming, something you can't stop, only weather. I've lived on this patch of dirt in Colorado for 42 years, bought it back when it was nothing but sagebrush, mule deer, and a busted-up mining cabin that smelled like wet dog in history, long before the asphalt pavers and the imported Italian marble fountains showed up next door. I was sitting on my porch that Tuesday, sipping coffee that was probably too strong for a man with my blood pressure, watching the mist lift off the peaks, just enjoying the fact that the only thing I had to answer to was the sunrise and my old blue-tick coonhound, Barnaby, but then I heard it, the distinct, aggressive crunch of tires on gravel that didn't belong to me, and I saw a white Range Rover gleaming like a fresh tooth pulling up to my gate, a gate that had a "No Trespassing" sign big enough to be read from orbit, and that electric feeling hit me. The storm had arrived, but it wasn't bringing rain, it was bringing Victoria St. Clair. I watched her get out of the car, and if you've never met a woman who wears white linen pants to walk on a dirt road, let me tell you, it speaks to a level of confidence bordering on delusion. She was the president of the Aspens at Silver Creek, the luxury gated community that had sprouted up around my property line like a bad rash about 5 years ago, swallowing up the valley floor with houses that had more bathrooms than occupants and lawns that drank more water than a small farm. Victoria didn't walk, she marched, clutching a clipboard like a weapon, flanked by 2 men in suits who looked like they were melting in the mountain sun, and before I could even set my mug down or tell Barnaby to hush, she was slapping a thick envelope onto my fence post with a piece of tape that probably cost more than my boots. "Mr. Montgomery," she called out, voice shrill enough to crack glass, not even bothering to come up the drive, just shouting across the yard like I was a deaf servant, "Since you refuse to check your mailbox, we are delivering this citation in person, consider yourself served." I didn't move fast, I haven't moved fast since '98, but I walked down there, pulled the envelope off the post, and opened it while she stood there with that smug, tight-lipped smile that looked like she'd just swallowed a canary and enjoyed the crunch. Inside was a document titled, "Final Notice of Non-Compliance and Lien Intent," and right there in bold, red letters was a number that made my knees lock up. $280,000. I looked at the number, then I looked at her, and I chuckled, a dry, dusty sound that seemed to annoy her more than if I'd screamed, and I said, "Victoria, darlin', unless this envelope is filled with winning lottery tickets, I think you've got the wrong house, seeing as I don't belong to your little club, never signed your papers, and frankly, I'd rather sleep in a snake pit than join your HOA." She adjusted her sunglasses, looking at my property, my vintage 1976 Ford Bronco sitting on blocks where I was restoring it, my chicken coop built from reclaimed barn wood, my stack of seasoned firewood, and she curled her lip like she smelled something rotting. "It doesn't matter if you signed, Caleb," she said, using my first name like it was an insult. "The board has determined that your structures encroach on community visual easements and, more importantly, our latest survey shows that your junkyard," that's what she called my life's work, "is actually sitting on 12 feet of the Aspens common area. You are trespassing, Mr. Montgomery, and we are fining you for 5 years of unauthorized use, plus damages to property values, plus legal fees." 12 feet, she was claiming my fence line, which my daddy and I pounded into the earth with sledgehammers back when Reagan was in office, was 12 feet off. I felt that heat rising up the back of my neck, the kind of anger that doesn't burn fast but simmers deep, and I stepped closer to the fence, looking her dead in the eye. "You listen to me, and you listen good. That fence hasn't moved an inch since before you were born, and just because your developer decided to draw pretty lines on a map doesn't mean you own the dirt under my boots. We have the surveys, Caleb," she snapped back, motioning to one of the melting suits who held up a glossy, colorful map that looked more like a cartoon than a legal document. "We have the lawyers, and we have the money. You have 30 days to pay the fine and move your debris, or we will foreclose on your property to recoup our losses, bulldoze this eyesore, and turn it into the overflow parking lot we so desperately need. Have a nice day." She spun on her heel, dismissed me like I was a beggar, and got back in her air-conditioned bubble, leaving me standing there in the dust with a piece of paper threatening to take the only thing I had left in this world. I went back to the porch, sat down, and my hands were shaking, not from fear, never from fear, but from the sheer, unadulterated rage of knowing that people like her thought they could just rewrite reality because they had a bigger bank account. I sat there until the sun went down, staring at that fence line, replaying the last 40 years in my head, the day I brought my late wife, Sarah, here, the spot by the big oak where we buried our first dog, the garden where she grew the best tomatoes in the county. If Victoria thought she was fighting an old man about 12 feet of dirt, she was wrong. She was fighting a man defending his memories, and that's a dangerous thing to do. But I knew bluster wouldn't beat billionaires. I needed cold, hard facts, so I went inside, poured myself a glass of rye, and dialed the one number I knew Victoria St. Clair wouldn't see coming. "Maps," I said when he picked up on the fourth ring, shouting over the sound of what I assumed was heavy metal music or a bandsaw. "It's Cal, put the beer down and listen, I've got a job for you, and it involves proving a bunch of rich city folks are dumber than a bag of hammers." Maps McGraw was a legend in the surveying world, a guy who looked like a wild mountain man with a beard down to his belt buckle but possessed a mind that worked like a supercomputer. He'd been mapping the Rockies since the 70s, knew every mining claim, every cattle trail, and every government benchmark from here to Utah, and when I told him what was happening, he didn't just agree to help, he cackled, a high, wheezing sound that made me smile for the first time that day. "Cal, buddy," he said, his voice raspy from years of smoking unfiltered cigarettes, "I've been waiting for someone to challenge that development. I saw their original plat maps when they filed them at the county 5 years ago, and something about the geometry just didn't sit right in my gut, like a puzzle piece hammered in with a mallet. I'll be their first light, and I'm bringing the big guns." The big guns turned out to be a truckload of equipment that looked like it belonged to NASA, drone LiDAR scanners, differential GPS units that could measure a gnat's eyelash from space, and a stack of yellowed, crumbling paper maps that smelled like mildew. Maps arrived at dawn, slamming the door of his battered pickup, spitting on the ground, and looking at the perfectly manicured lawn of the mansion next door, the one owned by a tech CEO named Sterling, with pure disgust. "Look at that," Maps grumbled, setting up a tripod on my porch. "They leveled the natural grade, moved thousands of tons of earth. Cal, when you move that much dirt, you bury the truth, but you can't kill it. We're gonna find the original section corners, the iron pins from the 1920s survey, not these plastic flags they stuck in the ground last week." For the next 3 weeks, my property looked like a crime scene investigation. Maps was out there rain or shine, hacking through brush, climbing down ravines, flying his drone in grid patterns that annoyed the hell out of the neighbors, and let me tell you, the Aspens did not take kindly to it. Within 2 days, Victoria was back, this time with a sheriff's deputy, claiming that Maps was invading the privacy of her residence with his drone. I stood at the gate again, leaning on a shovel, watching the deputy, a young kid named Miller who I'd known since he was in diapers, shift uncomfortably. "Mr. Montgomery," Miller said, trying to be official but failing, "Ms. St. Clair says your man is flying cameras into people's bathroom windows. You gotta ground the bird, Cal." "He's mapping the canopy, Miller," I said, spitting a sunflower seed shell onto the ground near Victoria's shoe. "It's FAA airspace. Unless he's hovering in her shower, he's legal, and frankly, looking at Victoria, I don't think anyone wants to see that show anyway." Victoria gasped, turning a shade of purple that clashed with her scarf. "Officer! Arrest this man for harassment. And get that drone out of the sky or I will have my security team shoot it down." "You shoot my drone, lady," Maps yelled from the roof of my barn, holding the controller, "and I'll sue you for destruction of federal aviation equipment so fast your head will spin off. Go ahead, make my day." The deputy sighed, looked at Victoria, and said, "Ma'am, it's a civil matter, unless he threatens you, I can't do anything. Cal, just, try to keep it low profile, okay?" They left, but the war had just begun. The next day, the water to my house mysteriously cut off. Someone had accidentally backhoed the main line while fixing a sprinkler on the HOA side. 2 days later, I found nails scattered all over my driveway. Then, the drone footage captured something interesting. Security guards from the Aspens walking the perimeter of my property at 3 a.m., shining lights into my windows, trying to rattle me, trying to make the old man crack, but they didn't. Know that I spent 2 years in a foxhole in Vietnam, and a flashlight in the window wasn't going to scare me off my land. it was just going to make me dig in deeper. Maps was working like a man possessed, processing data in my kitchen, his laptop humming next to the coffee pot, layering the new GPS data over the old 1885 mining claims and the 1950s homestead deeds. He was quiet, which was rare for him, mumbling about declination and magnetic shift and monument drift. I kept bringing him sandwiches and coffee, watching his face, waiting for the verdict. "It's weird, Cal," he said on the 10th night, rubbing his eyes, "the math isn't adding up, or rather, it is adding up, but the answer is insane. See, when they built the Aspens, they based their entire grid on a marker, a brass cap, that sits by the creek. They assumed it was the section corner, the holy grail of boundaries, but look at this." He pointed to a grainy image on the screen, a spectral scan from the LiDAR that could see through the vegetation. "See that depression in the earth? About 50 feet north of their marker. That looks like a stone cairn, buried under 4 feet of imported topsoil. If that's the real corner, then their entire grid, every lot, every road, every fence, it's all shifted south." "Shifted how much?" I asked, feeling that electric storm feeling coming back, stronger this time. "Enough to cause a problem," Maps whispered, grabbing his jacket. "Grab your flashlight, Cal, we're going digging, and bring the shotgun, just in case those security goons get curious." It was midnight, moonless and pitch black, when we crept out to the edge of the creek, right where the perfectly manicured ryegrass of the HOA met the wild willows of the stream. Maps had his metal detector, swinging it low, listening to the hum, whir. Beep. It was a solid, high-pitched scream from the machine. Maps fell to his knees, ignoring the mud ruining his jeans, and started digging with a hand trowel, tearing through the pristine sod that Victoria probably paid 10 grand to install. He dug down 1 foot, 2 feet, sweating, panting, and then, clink. He brushed away the dirt, shined his light into the hole, and there it was, a rough-hewn granite stone with a rusted iron pipe driven into the center, and stamped into the brass cap on top of the pipe was the date, 1902. It was the original General Land Office monument, the unmovable truth of the valley. Mapp sat back on his heels, looked at the monument, then looked up at the mansions looming over us in the dark, their security lights blinking like eyes. He pulled out his handheld GPS, placed it on the brass cap, let it average the position for 5 minutes, and then looked at me with a grin that was terrifying in the best way possible. "Cal," he said, his voice trembling with adrenaline, "you know how they said you were encroaching 12 feet onto their land?" "Yeah," I said, gripping the shovel. "Well," Maps chuckled, "they were using the wrong starting point, based on this stone, which is the legal controlling monument for the entire township. Your northern property line isn't the fence, your property line is 150 feet that way." He pointed directly into the darkness, right through the middle of the clubhouse, right through the swimming pool, and straight into the living rooms of the 3 biggest houses on the ridge. I stood there, trying to process the geometry of it. "Wait. Maps, are you saying?" "I'm saying," he interrupted, standing up and wiping the mud from his hands, "that you don't just own the buffer zone. Cal, you own the clubhouse, you own the 17th hole of the golf course, and you definitely own Victoria St. Clair's Rose Garden. This entire development is shifted south by 150 feet because some lazy surveyor 20 years ago used a reference marker that had moved in a landslide instead of digging for the real stone. We covered the hole back up, carefully, replacing the sod so no one would know we'd been there. We walked back to my house in silence, the gravity of it pressing down on us. This wasn't just a dispute anymore, this was a catastrophe for them, millions of dollars of real estate, legal titles, bank loans, all of it based on a lie that we just uncovered in the mud. The next morning, I woke up with a feeling I hadn't had in years, hope. I walked out to the porch, coffee in hand, and looked at the violation notice still taped to my window, $280,000. I laughed so hard Barnaby started barking. I picked up the phone and called my lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Sarah Beth who operated out of a strip mall but could out-argue the devil himself. "Sarah Beth," I said, "don't settle, don't offer them a dime. In fact, I want you to draft a counter-suit, and I want you to file an eviction notice." "Eviction?" she asked, sounded confused. For who, Cal? For everyone, I said, watching Victoria's white Range Rover drive past my house, unaware that she was driving on a road that belonged to me. I want to evict the homeowners association from my land. But Victoria wasn't done. She knew we were up to something. She must have seen the digging or sensed the shift in the air. 2 days later, I got served with a restraining order, claiming I was stalking board members, and they escalated the fine to $500,000, attaching a foreclosure hearing date for the following month. She was trying to crush me before I could play my hand, trying to bury me in paperwork and debt so I'd fold. She set up a community meeting at the clubhouse, my clubhouse, technically, to address the safety concerns regarding the resident at the valley floor. She was going to publicly crucify me, rally the wealthy neighbors to drive the crazy old man out of town. She sent an email blast, which Maps intercepted because he's good with computers too, calling me a danger to the community, and a blight on our property values. I looked at Maps, who was printing out giant, poster-sized maps with red overlay lines that looked like blood spilled across the blueprints of the aspens. You ready for this, Cal? Maps asked, rolling up the evidence. I'm ready, I said, putting on my Sunday best, a clean flannel shirt and my good cowboy hat. Let's go explain property rights to the aristocracy. We drove up the hill to the clubhouse that evening. The parking lot was full of Mercedes and Teslas. Security tried to stop us at the door, a big guy with an earpiece stepping in front of me. Private event, sir, residents only. I am a resident, I said, pushing past him. In fact, I'm the landlord. We walked into the main hall, crystal chandeliers twinkling, waiters passing champagne. Victoria was on a stage, microphone in hand, a giant projection of my junkyard on the screen behind her. She looked like a queen addressing her subjects. And so, she was saying, her voice dripping with fake concern, we have no choice but to remove Mr. Montgomery for the safety and aesthetic integrity of the aspens. It is a tragedy, really, that some people just can't adapt to civilized standards. The room murmured in agreement, heads nodding, wine glasses clinking. I walked straight down the center aisle, the heavy thud of my boots on the hardwood silencing the room row by row. Maps followed, carrying his easel and charts. Excuse me. Victoria shouted into the mic, security. Remove him. Sit down, Victoria. I bellowed, my voice honed by years of shouting over drilling rigs, booming off the vaulted ceiling. It stunned her into silence. You want to talk about property lines? You want to talk about theft? Let's talk. I climbed onto the stage, ignoring the gasps. Maps set up the easel. I looked out at the sea of faces, doctors, lawyers, tech moguls, people who thought they owned the world, and I felt a calm wash over me. You folks fined me $500,000 for a fence you said was 12 feet over the line. I started, speaking quietly now, forcing them to lean in. You called me a squatter, you called me trash. Well, my friend here, Mr. McGraw, he found the 1902 section corner last night, buried under your hydrangeas. Maps flipped the first chart over. It was a satellite photo of the neighborhood. This is where you think the lines are, I said. Maps flipped the next chart, red lines slashed across the image, shifting everything north. And this, I said, pointing to the screen, is where the lines actually are. The room went dead silent. I walked over to the map and traced a line with my finger. Mrs. St. Clair, you see this line here? The one that goes right through your kitchen island and cuts your infinity pool in half. She stared at it, her mouth opening and closing like a fish. That's my property line, I said, turning to face the crowd, and you're all standing in my living room. Chaos, absolute chaos. People started shouting. Victoria was screaming at her lawyer. The security guards didn't know who to tackle, but I just stood there, watching the realization wash over them. The power had shifted, the storm had broken, and the floodwaters were rising fast. But here's the thing about people with money, they don't give up, they get mean. Victoria looked at me, her face twisted into something ugly, something desperate. This is a lie, she shrieked, a forgery. I will bury you in court until you can't afford the dirt to be buried in. You think a piece of paper scares me? We will destroy you. I tipped my hat. "I'll see you in court, darlin', bring your checkbook." We walked out, leaving them in turmoil, but as we drove back down the hill, Maps looked at me, his face serious. "Cal, you know they're going to come at us with everything, right? They're going to try to prove adverse possession, they're going to try to invalidate the 1902 stone, this isn't over." "I know," I said, looking at the lights of the houses sitting on my land, but for the first time in 5 years. "I'm not the one trespassing. But I was wrong about one thing. I thought it would be a legal battle. I didn't expect them to get physical. I didn't expect to wake up 3 nights later to the smell of smoke and the sound of Barnaby barking his head off as orange flames licked up the side of my barn. They weren't just going to sue me, they were going to burn me out. That smell of old pine burning is something that stays in your nose for a lifetime, sweet and acrid all at once, like a campfire gone wrong. I stumbled off the porch in my boxers, grabbing the garden hose before my brain had even fully registered the orange glow licking up the side of the barn. The water pressure was weak, pitifully weak, spitting out a stream that looked like a child's squirt gun against a dragon, but adrenaline is a funny thing, it turns 71-year-old joints into steel springs, and I was running, shouting for Maps who was sleeping in the guest room, dousing the dry grass around the foundation to starve the beast before it could climb to the roof where 30 years of dry hay were waiting to turn the whole valley into a torch. Maps came stumbling out in his long johns, looking like a panicked yeti, grabbing a shovel and throwing dirt on the base of the flames, and for 20 minutes it was just us, 2 old men fighting the devil in the dark, coughing on smoke, eyes stinging, until finally, the hiss of steam replaced the roar of the fire and we stood there, chest heaving, soot-stained, looking at the charred black scar running up the side of my history. It wasn't an electrical fault, I knew that barn's wiring. Because I installed it myself with conduit thick enough to stop a bullet, and it wasn't lightning because the sky was clear as a bell. Looking down in the mud near the diesel tank, I saw it, the faint, waffle-stomped imprint of a hiking boot, fresh, deep, and heading straight back toward the property line of the Aspens. The sheriff came out, Miller again, looking tired and sympathetic, taking photos of the boot print and the scorch marks, but he shook his head in that way that tells you nothing is going to happen before he even opens his mouth. "Cal," he said, clicking his pen, "I can't prove who made that print, could be a hiker, could be a kid, unless you got video of someone striking the match, it's just a suspicious origin. I'll file the report, but don't hold your breath." I watched his taillights fade, and that's when the fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard clarity that settled in my gut like a stone. They weren't just trying to take my land, they were trying to erase me, and if they were willing to burn down a man's livelihood, they had abandoned the rules of civilized society, so I abandoned them too. "Maps," I said, wiping soot off my forehead, "get the laptop, we aren't just proving where the line is anymore. I want to know who drew the fake one." The next 3 months were a blur of legal warfare that would have broken a lesser man, or at least a poorer one. I liquidated my savings, I sold the restored '69 Camaro I'd been keeping for a rainy day, and I poured every cent into Sarabetha's retainer because she was hiring forensic geologists and title researchers who charged by the minute. The Aspens Lawyers, a firm from Denver with 3 names on the door and offices in a glass tower, hit us with a tsunami of paperwork, interrogatories, requests for production, motions to dismiss, motions to suppress the GPS evidence. They tried to bury us in paper, hoping I'd suffocate under the weight of the legal fees. But they didn't account for Maps. While the lawyers argued about statutes of limitations, Maps was digging through the digital archives of the county recorder's office, looking at metadata on the original development PDFs. He was looking for the ghost in the machine, the digital fingerprint of the original sin, and one rainy Tuesday, while I was fixing the charred siding on the barn, he came running out of the house waving a piece of paper like he'd found the golden ticket. "I got Cal," he was screaming, actually dancing a jig in the mud, "I got the bastards." He slapped the paper down on the workbench. It was an email chain, dated 6 years ago, recovered from the dissolved assets of the original engineering firm that laid out the Aspens. It was between the lead engineer and, you guessed it, the developer board, which included Victoria St. Clair's husband. I put on my reading glasses, squinting at the tiny print. The engineer wrote, "Sir, we have a problem with the northern boundary, the 1902 monument is about 150 feet south of where we projected. If we honor the true line, we lose lots 1, 2, and 3, the premium Creekside estates. That's $12 million in inventory. And the reply, sent 2 hours later from the developer, ignore the stone, use the 1985 fence post as the control, nobody checks the geometry on raw land these days, just get it stamped and filed. Fraud, I whispered, the word tasting sweet on my tongue. It's not a mistake, it's not negligence, it's deliberate, criminal fraud. Adverse possession doesn't apply if the occupation was based on fraud, Mapp said, grinning like a wolf. You can't steal land and claim it's yours just because you held it for 5 years if you knew you were stealing it. This email kills their good faith defense dead in the water. We walked into the deposition room 2 weeks later like we owned the building. Victoria was there, looking less like a queen and more like a cornered animal, her eyes darting around the room, flanked by her lawyers who were still smirking because they didn't know what we had. They started off aggressive, asking me if I was senile, asking if I understood the concept of acquiescence, trying to get me to admit I'd accepted the fence line as the boundary. I let them talk. I let them insult me. I let them pile up their arrogance until it was a towering monument to their own stupidity, and then Sarabeth slid the email across the table, face down. Mrs. St. Clair, Sarabeth said, her voice silky smooth, were you aware that your husband was informed of the boundary discrepancy 6 years ago? Objection, the lead lawyer shouted, hearsay. Irrelevant. It's not hearsay if it's in the discovery packet you failed to review, Sarabeth said, flipping the paper over. Victoria looked down, read the email, and all the color drained from her face, leaving her looking like a wax statue melting under heat. She knew. She looked at her lawyer, who was suddenly very interested in his own shoes, and then she looked at me, and for the first time, I saw genuine fear. But they didn't fold. Rich people don't fold until the judge brings the hammer down. They took it to trial. The Harrison v. The Aspens at Silver Creek HOA. The courtroom was packed, standing room only, reporters from the state capitol, curious locals, and half the residents of the Aspens who were starting to realize their property titles might be worth less than the paper they were printed on. The trial lasted 4 days, and it was a bloodbath. Their expert witness, a slick surveyor who clearly hadn't been in the field in 20 years, tried to argue that modern accepted usage trumped ancient monuments. He threw around terms like estoppel and laches, trying to confuse the jury with legalese. But then Mapps took the stand. Mapps didn't wear a suit, he wore clean jeans and a button-down shirt that was tight in the shoulders, and he brought the stone, well, not the stone itself, but a 3D LiDAR scan of the stone in the hole, projected onto a massive screen. He explained the math, simple, elegant, undeniable. He explained that in land law, the monument is king. If the deed says, to the stone, you go to the stone. You don't stop at the fence because it's convenient. Ladies and gentlemen, Mapps said, looking at the jury, if you move the starting line of a race 100 yards forward without telling anyone, you haven't won the race, you've cheated, and geometry doesn't lie, it doesn't have an opinion, and it doesn't care how much money you have. When the verdict came in, the silence in the courtroom was heavy enough to crush a man. The jury foreman, a schoolteacher from the next town over, stood up with the paper shaking in her hands. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Caleb Montgomery, on all counts. She continued, her voice gaining strength, we find the 2010 survey to be fraudulent, we find the true boundary to be the 1902 section corner, and we award punitive damages in the amount of. I didn't even hear the money amount. I was watching Victoria. She slumped forward, putting her head in her hands, her empire crumbling around her ears. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Reynolds who I had fished with once or twice 30 years ago, banged her gavel. The court orders that the defendants have 90 days to vacate the encroaching lands or reach a settlement with the landowner. Adjourned. 90 days, that was the death knell. That meant they had to move their houses, rip up the pools, jackhammer the foundations. We were talking about tens of millions of dollars in demolition and reconstruction, practically bankrupting the entire HOA and probably half the homeowners individually. We walked out of the courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras, but I didn't stop for interviews. I just wanted to go home, sit on my porch, and listen to the quiet, but the quiet didn't last long. The next morning, a black sedan pulled up to my gate, no crunching tires this time. It was slow, respectful. Out stepped Victoria and a man I recognized as Nathan Sterling, the tech CEO whose living room was currently sitting on my pasture. They didn't march, they shuffled, they stood at the gate, waiting for me to acknowledge them. I let them wait while I finished my coffee, then I walked down, Barnaby trotting at my heels. "Mr. Montgomery," Sterling started, his voice shaky, we are here to talk about the judgment." "I figured," I said, leaning on the post, "you boys ready to start moving some dirt? I know a guy with a bulldozer if you need a recommendation." Victoria looked up, her eyes red-rimmed, stripped of all that linen suit arrogance. "Caleb, please, we can't move the houses, it would destroy us, the bank would call the loans, we would be destitute." "Is that so?" I asked, looking at the view, "kind of like how you were going to foreclose on me for a fence line? Kind of like how you were going to take my home for $280,000. She flinched like I'd slapped her. I was wrong. I am sorry." "Sorry doesn't fix my barn, Victoria," I said, my voice hard, "and sorry doesn't pay my legal bills." "We will pay them," Sterling interjected quickly, "we will pay everything, the damages, the fees, the barn, plus, we want to make an offer for the land." "Not for sale," I said immediately. "Mr. Montgomery, please," Sterling pleaded, "name your price, 2 million. 5 million. For the strip of land. We just need the easement." I looked at them, desperate, terrified, and I thought about taking the money. $5 million would set me up for life, set my grandkids up, but then I looked at the land, my land, and I realized that if I sold it to them, they won, they bought their way out of a crime, they learned nothing except that everything has a price tag, and I wasn't going to let them learn that lesson from me. "I told you," I said, "the dirt ain't for sale, never was, never will be, this is Montgomery land." Victoria started to sob, a jagged, ugly sound. "Then what do you want from us? Do you want to see us homeless?" "No," I said, and a slow smile spread across my face, "I don't want you homeless. I'm not a monster, Victoria. I'm a businessman, and since you're living on my land, and you can't move, I guess that makes you my tenants." They stopped breathing. "Tenants?" "That's right," I said, pulling a folded piece of paper from my pocket that Sarah Beth and I had drafted over whiskey the night before. "Ground leases, 99-year lease, renewable by mutual agreement, you keep your houses, you keep your pools, but the land underneath them stays mine." And the rent?" Sterling asked, bracing himself. "Market value," I said, "commercial rates, plus a few, let's call them aggravation surcharges." "Victoria, for that pool and the rose garden?" "That'll be $2,000 a month." "Sterling, for your living room and garage?" $1,500, and for the clubhouse?" I paused, savoring the moment. "The HOA will pay me $5,000 a month for the use of the clubhouse and the golf course hole, and one more thing." "What?" Victoria whispered. "The rules," I said, "if I'm the landlord, I make the rules, no more telling me what color my truck needs to be, no more complaining about my chickens, and I want a key to the pool gate, my doctor says swimming is good for my arthritis." They signed, they didn't have a choice, they signed the leases right there on the hood of the sedan, shaking hands that felt like dead fish, and just like that, the war was over, not with a bang, but with the scratch of a pen. That was a year ago, and let me tell you, life in the valley has changed. Every first of the month, I walk down to my mailbox, and there they are, checks, rental checks from the people who tried to destroy me. I took the first month's rent and bought a brand new tractor. I took the second month's rent and rebuilt the barn, bigger and better than before, with a sprinkler system that could put out a forest fire. But the money isn't the best part is the shift in the air. When I drive my muddy truck through the neighborhood now, nobody glares, they wave, partially because they're afraid of me, sure, but also because they know I saved them. I could have bulldozed their lives, and I chose to let them stay. I hold the deed, I hold the power, and I hold the high ground. Victoria is different now, quieter. She resigned from the HOA board a month after the trial. I see her sometimes when I go down to swim laps in the pool that sits on my land. She's usually gardening, ripping out those exotic, water-guzzling roses and planting native wildflowers because I suggested they look better. She waves, a little tentative, and I wave back. She learned that you can't manicure nature into submission, and you can't bully a man who knows where his cornerstones are buried. Maps comes over on Sundays for barbecue. We sit on the porch, watching the sunset over the aspens, drinking beer paid for by the rent from the clubhouse. He likes to remind me that we technically own the 17th hole flagstick, and threatens to go pull it out just to mess with the golfers, but I tell him to let it be. We made our point. You know, folks always ask me if I regret not taking the $5 million. They say I'm crazy for turning down a fortune to deal with tenants and hassle, but I tell them, there are things in this world worth more than a check with a lot of zeros. There's the feeling of knowing that you stood your ground when the wind tried to blow you over. There's the knowledge that your daddy's fence line meant something. And there's the look on a billionaire's face when they realize that all the money in the world can't move a granite stone buried in the mud of history. Justice isn't always a gavel banging in a courtroom. Sometimes, justice is a monthly rent check, a warm pool on a Tuesday morning, and the sweet, deep silence of a valley that knows exactly who it belongs to. So let me ask you this, if you were in my boots, if they offered you the millions to walk away and let them win, would you take the cash and leave your history behind? Or would you dig in, find your cornerstones, and become the landlord of your enemies? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one of them, right here from my porch, on the land that's been Montgomery land for 40 years, and thanks to a little geometry and a lot of stubbornness, is going to stay that way forever. Thanks for listening.